Good afternoon. My name is Luis Felipe, and today I'm going to present the topic cross-country analysis of BIM enforcement by the public sector. The presentation will be divided into an introduction, followed by the methodology of the thesis. Next chapters represent the main themes of the study, being a scoping review, BIM mandates, and experts' perspectives, finishing with conclusions and future works. Building information modeling is a technology and methodology that has revolutionized the AEC industry by promoting collaborative work among stakeholders with building lifecycle data managed in a digital environment. It has led to reduction in costs, time, and errors, increased collaboration and quality of assets, being the clients or owners one of the main benefited from its implementation. Despite all the benefits, broader BIM adoption remains a challenging task. Among some barriers identified are insufficient client demand and a lack of policies and mandates that create an enabling environment for widespread BIM adoption. Governments and public clients have shown to play a major role in large-scale BIM adoption by requiring or enforcing BIM usage in construction projects and facilitating BIM implementation through public policies. Another aspect to consider is the approach to BIM implementation. OpenBIM represents the usage of open workflows and standards that allow enhanced collaboration, increased interoperability, and sustainability of digital data. It supports numerous applications like life cycle assessment, building energy modeling, and digitalization of heritage buildings. All these gains through the OpenBIM approach are of great interest to public clients given the scope of their projects and diversity of professionals involved. Considering the benefits from BIM implementation, the role of governments in BIM adoption, and advantages of the Open BIM approach, the thesis was focused on understanding how BIM has been enforced in multiple countries around the world and their consideration of an open approach. To achieve this, the thesis was divided into three stages. First, a scoping review was performed to identify how worldwide BIM enforcement has been studied and to get an idea of what a BIM mandate is. Second stage consisted of studying BIM mandates collected from the literature, summarizing their main points and defining general approaches and structure. Lastly, an online survey was delivered to BIM experts from different countries to gather their knowledge of BIM mandates, and a couple of structured interviews were carried with experts available. In the scoping review, two scientific databases were consulted, namely Scopus and Web of Science. A search query based on three keyword clusters and connecting proximity operators was designed to retrieve relevant studies. A flow diagram of the records identified, screened, assessed, and included was defined. From the 16 documents considered, mentions of BIM enforcement in different countries around the world were collected and summarized. A total of 26 countries from multiple continents were addressed. This map shows in color the countries mentioned in the literature to have a large-scale BIM initiative, relating the color darkness to the date of their first BIM initiative. Other countries may have BIM adoption initiatives, but are not widely discussed in the literature. We can see how the USA, the Scandinavian countries, UK, and Singapore carried the first BIM initiatives worldwide, followed by other countries in America, Europe, and Asia. It also shows how European countries have a diversity in the time their initial efforts to adopt BIM are put in place. This timeline presents the initiatives by each country and the time they were presented. We can see how the first actions were taken around the year 2007, leading to a large adoption by other countries in the following decade. These actions tend to be either enforcement in the year they were presented, scheduled enforcement to a later date in time, around 2 to 5 years, and a stage approach, increasing the requirements and obligations in a periodical manner. One of the mechanisms that governments and public institutions employ to adopt BIM in a large scale are the BIM mandates. Based on the literature and after analyzing the approaches carried in different countries, we define a BIM mandate as a document produced by a large public institution or government enforcing the usage of BIM for construction projects, being them buildings or infrastructure. It may define the requirements, the size or budget the project's this enforcement applies to, and the dates it goes into effect. With the definition in place, the second stage of the thesis consisted of gathering documents that match the definition proposed for a BIM mandate from different countries. Documents like guidelines or roadmaps were not considered as mandates. Mentions of BIM mandates in the literature were looked up in search engines, with additional documents suggested by experts. Based on the collection, 20 BIM mandates from 14 countries were summarized. 4 types of approaches were identified. A fundamentals approach consisted of presenting broad concepts about BIM adoption, without going into specific details on how to do it, allowing for a more flexible implementation. A structured implementation approach considers the whole BIM implementation, discussing the organization structure, requirements, and main underlying concepts. These mandates tend to be supported by an organization that takes charge of BIM diffusion in their context, like commissions or committees. A focus approach sets a specific BIM target to be accomplished without defining how it will be done. Putting an example, the case of UK and their government construction strategy with the requirement of fully collaborative 3D BIM. Lastly, the priority on requirements approach goes into the specific outcomes, deliverables, and processes that are expected from the BIM implementation, like guidelines where the public entities are the clients. A general structure for a BIM mandate was also identified. It starts by defining the publishing entity and date. The entity could be a municipality, authority, secretariat, department, government, ministry, presidency, or a state-owned enterprise. It's followed by the motivation to adopt BIM. It then defines the subject entities like agencies, administrative units, departments, authorities, or ministries. The works like new construction projects, refurbishment, reinforcement, or expansion, and life cycle stages like planning, design, construction, operation, and maintenance. It defines the targeted works for the BIM enforcement based on a value threshold that can be unique or decrease over time to encompass more works. It contains the possibility to enforce BIM on projects not included in the scope, but also allows to exempt BIM usage if properly justified, like exceptional conditions or not feasible to apply. Other topics addressing the mandates are the usage of open standards, digital information management through a central system, definition of target uses and information requirements, staff training, integration with geographic databases, among others. Lastly, they include actions to monitor the BIM implementation, assessing difficulties and suggesting improvements to the policies, being these actions carried by the same responsible institution or one created to manage the BIM adoption, like a commission, committee, or task group. The third stage consisted of creating an online survey to gather additional BIM mandates suggested by BIM experts from different countries. It inquires for the expert's profession and country of application of the mandate. Based on the replies to the BIM mandates question, it was observed that there may not be a clear understanding of what a BIM mandate refers to, with some listing common BIM uses in their context as mandates. An invitation to a structured interview was proposed to the participants. From it, 6 professionals showed interest and 3 were available for the interview. The interviewed experts were from Switzerland, Italy, and Spain. In the case of Switzerland, they don't count with a BIM mandate, but it doesn't mean there are not efforts for large-scale BIM implementation, having institutions like Swiss Railways and KBOB taking a leading role in adopting BIM. It was also observed the importance of handling the transition between traditional practices and the new requirements from the introduction of BIM, calling for the input from all the stakeholders of the industry to guarantee an adequate enforcement of BIM. In the case of Italy, they count with a BIM mandate that has been in place for a couple of years. It's mentioned how the introduction of the mandate influenced the BIM implementation on large-scale projects. But it was also noticed that small entities like towns struggle with the BIM implementation. As the mandate enforces BIM usage, the contracting authorities must require BIM, but they may not be prepared to handle the information and processes that come from the methodology, even though there are articles in the mandate related to personal training and software and hardware acquisition. In the case of Spain, they introduced a BIM mandate last year based on a BIM plan produced by a national commission. Other adoption measures have been taken on a state level, showing the benefits of BIM adoption by public institutions, but this mandate applies to a national scale. It's observed how properly defined are the different milestones from the mandate, increasing the required maturity of the contracting and contracted parties in a progressive manner. Some insights from the mandate introduction are the necessity for a national BIM guideline that supports the BIM adoption by the public entities that require it. Some institutions may already have BIM strategies in place, but other smaller ones will find a guide adapted to the national context as a valuable resource. Also, the mandate envisions the creation of a supporting office for BIM adoption that has not been established, adding to the challenge that measures included on a BIM mandate may not translate to real actions. All the experts agree that an open BIM approach will benefit the public institutions, as the application of open standards allow for increased interoperability of the projects given the diversity of actors involved and the long-term availability of digital data for further leverage and retrieval. The mandates should declare the specific standards that allow for this approach, like IFC, BCF, ISO 19650, COBE, or others that are available in their context as to be clear on how to implement an open approach. In conclusion, BIM is of great interest to public institutions worldwide. Numerous initiatives have been carried in the last 2 decades to increase the BIM adoption in a large scale. From this, the BIM mandates represent a clear mechanism adopted by governments to speed the adoption process, while considering the need for other actions like guidelines or roadmaps. After reviewing BIM mandates from different countries around the world, some patterns were identified in their approach, categorized as fundamentals, structured implementation, focus, and priority on requirements. Additionally, a common framework of the content of a BIM mandate was defined, serving as a benchmark for others to consider. Lastly, with the input from BIM experts, it was observed a mixed awareness of what a BIM mandate represents. With the interviews done, insights of how BIM mandates can be better formulated, possible effects of their introduction, and suggested improvements to them were obtained, with the relevance of the open BIM approach inclusion. The study can be further enlarged by contacting experts from other countries that were not included in the analysis performed, or countries where no experts were contacted. Given the context-based nature of BIM mandates, many are in the mother language where they are produced. Having an expert that serves as a bridge to analyze the documents will help to compare with other approaches already studied and enlarge the understanding of them. It also allows for the analysis of professionals' perspective on the impacts of BIM mandates on larger scale adoption.